everyone. Welcome to the August 25th edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona. My usual co-host Craig Mulkowski still unable to join for the latter half of this week, but I'm happy to have on a guest to help me handicap this Travers Day Pick-5 on Saturday. Nick Tammaro, somebody who follows the New York circuit pretty closely. Nick is the Sam Houston track announcer, Keeneland morning line maker, handicapper, contest player. I don't know if I missed anything. You wear many hats. Nick, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. No, I'll take that as a description. Certainly well enough. If you keep going, it might be something negative. So we'll leave it at that. But great to join you, and excited about this card.
Yeah, it really did come up a nice card. I think you've got a good mix at Saratoga on Saturday of both star power and really intriguing races to handicap, especially the Travers, which is a 7-horse field, but a lot to dive into. Among them, really something positive to say about just about every horse in that race. We'll get to that towards the end of this Pick-5 sequence. And Nick, as we look at this on Friday morning, I think we're just kind of crossing our fingers and hoping that we can stay on the turf for as many races as possible on Saturday. I know they've gotten some rain, more predicted possibly to come between Friday and Saturday. Only 2 turf races in this Pick-5 sequence are carded for the grass. The first, the race 8, is a turf sprint, an allowance race that we certainly hope would stay on the grass because it would really be detrimental to the sequence if it came off. I imagine they'll do everything they can to keep the sword dancer on, but it's just been a real problem throughout this Saratoga meet. Mother Nature has not been kind to Saratoga.
Yeah, it's been rough weather-wise, no doubt about it. I mean, 50 as of this, as you said, Friday morning, I believe the number is now 54 turf races lost at the meet, which in 30 days is really incredible. But yeah, fingers crossed for good weather. Hopefully, we can see a little bit of sunshine on Saturday. I think the National Weather Service forecast looks a little bit better, so hoping for the best, no doubt about it. But yeah, really exciting way to get the sequence started, no doubt.
Yeah, this sequence runs races 8 through 12. This is the mandatory mandatory payout, I should say, Pick-5 sequence. There is another Pick-5 sequence stacked on top of this that does end in the last race of the day, race 13, 9 through 13. But we're going to talk about the mandatory payout sequence that does include the 4 Grade 1 races that run 9 through 12. And I'm personally not upset that they carded the Pick-5s this way. I'm never going to cry any tears about leaving out a maiden special weight full of first-time starters, which is kind of smack dab in the middle of the card, so I'm okay with that race not being in a sequence. But we will begin our discussion of this mandatory payout Pick-5 with race 8. It is a turf sprint allowance N1X, full field signed on for this one, 12 in the main body of the field. You got 1 also eligible. And Nick, I think we should mention that also eligible horse, the number 13 Super Quest, because he's a runner that I think you would have to make some decisions about if there's just 1 scratch and he draws into the race.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to start there because he's going to have a huge impact on this race if he gets in. It's worth noting as well that Irad has first preference on this horse. So if he gets in, he's riding the 13. Obviously, if it's the 12 who scratches, it's a moot point. But if they both end up going, then Irad will be on Super Quest. And of course, Super Quest runner-up finish last time out behind Sosua Summer looks a little bit better after Sosua Summer's comeback win yesterday. And the other thing, of course, that Super Quest would add to the mix here is speed. And the horses that I picked primarily are ones that I think are going to be a little bit more forwardly placed. And I think the entirety of my opinion in this race is sort of anti-Southern horse, which if a horse like Super Quest gets in, it undoubtedly helps Southern horses' chances. So yeah, he's one that you're going to have to tab very closely in terms of whether he gets in via a scratch. It is a full field of 12, as you mentioned. I thought there were 2 horses that were pretty interesting in here, David. The first of which was the 10 Extendo for Carlos David, who's had a couple of wins at the meet and quietly had some horses run relatively well. This is a horse who clearly needs Lasix. And I know that the Lasix and stakes arguments is a little bit like the chicken or the egg, because is this horse running poorly because he ran against stakes horses, or did he run poorly because he didn't have Lasix? I'm going to assume, as well as he's run, especially from a speed figure perspective, with Lasix, that he is a horse who simply needs it. He looks like the main speed on the outside. He gets in light with Jamie Torres. I think he looks very, very dangerous in this kind of position. And I thought the 5 Harry Time very much fit the profile of the kind of horse that I want to bet in this type of race. Coming out of the Mahoney, where he drew the rail, and Luis Saez really did the only thing he could have, which was try and put him in the game as much as he could. And I think once he asked Harry Time out of the gate, the horse got a little aggressive as well. And they went and got involved in a very, very strong pace. So I'm going to give him an excuse for losing that race, and he gets back into a situation where he's being treated with Lasix. Now he'll get a more of a stalking trip. Those two both to me felt like interesting horses at good prices, assuming this field stays perfectly intact.
Yeah, those are both horses I spent a long time looking at. I ended up taking more of the negative view of both of them, but I understand the case. I mean, Extendo, I couldn't quite make up my mind if I thought he was just a synthetic specialist or not, but you do make an interesting point about the Lasix. Maybe he is a horse that needs that. I wish I had seen him getting over the turf better in that one grass race at Gulfstream, but he was coming off a slight layoff that day, so we'll see. He definitely is a horse that has a ton of early speed. I personally did see quite a bit of speed in this race. Maybe some of them are not going to go. Extendo obviously maybe has the best early speed, and if the number 13 Superquest does not draw in, it definitely helps anybody that wants to be forwardly placed. I mean, there are a couple of first-time turfers in here that I think, or I should say, horses switching over to the turf that you maybe want to take a look at. Talkin' Pharaoh is perhaps the most interesting of those because this horse has a huge turf pedigree. The dam Just Talkin', I believe, is a full sister to Lady Shipman, and Wesley Ward tried to get this horse on turf as a 2-year-old, just couldn't stand up on it that day. I don't know, maybe it was a horse that just couldn't do much running back then, but seems like he's really turned his career around for Linda Rice, and interesting, he's going back to the surface. Another one that I was kind of trying to talk myself into, but I couldn't quite get there. Acoustic Avenue, a horse that has plenty of turf, or I should say plenty of ability, maybe not so much turf breeding, but McLean's Music, they can handle it. There is some turf on the dam side, so I was trying to give him a look. I think if those two handle the turf, they could potentially force the pace a little bit, but that's a bit of a... They're wild cards in this field. I ended up going towards the inside, the number 2, Monet Never. This is a horse that got the job done last time narrowly against a maiden special weight field, coming off a bit of a layoff. He's a runner that had shown some ability early in his career at Gulfstream, reportedly came out of that Keeneland race with an excuse. I think Phil Antonaccia said he had a minor injury coming out of that race, but got back on track last time at Saratoga. I just liked the way he sliced through the pack and got the victory, and the two horses who finished directly behind him, City Fever and American NoHo, both came back to run really well, with City Fever winning next time, and they earned improved speed figures in that subsequent start. So I just think that race might be a bit better than the speed figure suggests, and he's supposed to get the right kind of trip, especially if some pace does develop on the front end.
Yeah, I was I guess I was a little bit more critical of him only because I felt like he sort of needed, I mean, he was sort of at the poker table at the eighth pole and needed runner to get the job done, and kind of got it. Like, he got every split he needed to. He got into the right spot at exactly the right time. He will definitely be dangerous. And you're taking the approach that this is going to be a particularly fast-paced race. I think it's going to be a forced pace. My hope, honestly, with Harry Time is that he's taken a couple of lengths off of it. But if you're believing it's a fast-paced race, I mean, you have to like the race that he ran last time out, and there's no denying that City Fever, being a second-time starter, of course, which you would expect him to improve, he improves in his next start. So I don't have a big argument against Monet Never. Actually, I think I picked him third or fourth. Yeah, I thought he was a horse that was dangerous. I mean, I guess we have to mention Southern Horse, at least in terms of where we stand on him. This is the kind of horse to me that's very difficult to form a positive opinion on, in that previously, I mean, he's really needed every bit of 6+ furlongs to get going, and now he's going to be in a 5.5 furlong race. And, these are races that are just generally run at such a frenetic early clip that I have a hard time believing he could get there. Did you think he could? I know you made him the favorite, and I think he'll be the favorite. I just didn't really want to use him.
Yeah, he's sort of a tough horse to read in this race. I mean, just looking at the TimeformUS pace projector, it's kind of stark to see how far back behind the field he is. I mean, he just has no early speed, and everybody else in this race, I mean, they kind of have some amount of tactical speed, so I think it depends on the break how fast this pace is going to be, but it does feel like a lot of horses are going to be bunched towards the front end, so he's really going to need some racing luck to find a trip, and he's drawn that far outside post position, which maybe is not so detrimental as a deep closer. His speed figures stack up really well against this field, and if you're just looking at his his figures compared to the rest of these, he's the horse to beat. But it's kind of interesting when you sift through his form in Southern California. Every time he stepped up to this N1X allowance level, he just proved not good enough. So you do wonder about his class a little bit. Sometimes those races out in California can come up a little bit tougher on a consistent basis, in these allowance races than maybe on the East Coast, where there's a bit more variability in the quality of these races. I I ended up taking the more positive view of him because I do think this pace is going to heat up a little bit, but he's not the kind of horse I'd want to lean on at any kind of short price. One more bigger price that I wanted to just mention in this race is the number 8 Detroit City. He's one that I was sort of on the fence about because there are some perhaps negative signs with him or some red flags. I mean, he is a horse that was entered for $35,000 a little bit earlier in this meet, and they scratched the running in this spot instead. On his best day, he definitely has the ability to be competitive with this field, and I can easily make an excuse for his last race at Keeneland when he missed the break and was just always out of position. He's now coming back as a new gelding. Just a tough horse to really wrap your head around, but he's going to be a really big price in this race for connections that don't take money, so he's one that I want to include somewhere.
Yeah, I hear you. This is a horse who I've bet numerous times throughout his career, including, I think, in his debut, where he busted out of the gate with John Velazquez, and I thought I was getting all the money, and he promptly stopped to have a siesta at the 8th pole.
Let's move on to the stakes portion of this Pick-5 sequence. Race 9 is the H. Allen Jerkins Memorial, going 7 furlongs for the 3-year-olds on the main track. And Nick, only 6 runners signed on, but this is still a pretty interesting race to handicap. You've got a lot of quality in here, especially among the 4 that are drawn towards the outside in the starting gate. And Bob Baffert has sent 2 of his runners from Southern California to compete here, Arabian Lion and Fort Bragg. What do you make of them? How do you assess New York Thunder, who comes off that huge speed figure victory in the Amsterdam last time? This is not an easy race to really have a strong opinion.
Yeah. I mean, to steal a line from our mutual friend Andy Serling, to me, New York Thunder is the last time was the time horse. If you didn't get him at 5.5 to 1 against, Drew's Gold and Deer District, then you're probably not making a good gamble to take him at half that against Arabian Lion and Fort Bragg. And so I guess to sum it up, who do I think is going to win this race? I think Bob Baffert's going to win this race. I don't really know how well I can separate his 2 horses. I think they're both ideally suited to a 7-furlong trip. I think Fort Bragg's effort in the Dwyer, while I'll admit, and this is why as handicappers, we have the benefit of going back and watching races over and over and looking at them more critically. I didn't really think right after the Dwyer. I was a little underwhelmed is what I should say. And then when I saw the time and I saw the speed figure, I thought to myself, okay, that was a lot better than I thought. And then obviously Saudi Crown came out of it and ran exceptionally well in the Jim Dandy. Reportedly, both Fort Bragg and Arabian Light have been training extremely well. Fort Bragg maybe even a little bit better. And we'll get some info in the DRF Clocker report, which is invaluable for a card like this. Shameless plug, of course, for the DRF. And so I think one of those 2 is going to win. I would probably have found myself, if it was a bit weaker field, warming up to a horse like Verifying. I like the cutback for Verifying. I just think this is a Shark Tank. And this is probably a little bit too much. The other thing about Brad Cox is that Brad Cox does just about everything well. He's not really all that great coming back. He's good. It's hard to say that a trainer that hits it around a 25% clip is not that great. He wins with a lot of obvious horses doing that. And this is not an obvious horse. This is a horse who's going to have to run better than he ever has before, just assuming that even one of the big 3 on the outside show up with what we've seen from them now on a somewhat regular basis. So I'm going to use the 4 and 6. I'm going to feel pretty confident that one of them is going to get there.
Yeah, it sounds like we're pretty much on the same page here. I typically like to warm up to horses like Verifying in races like this that are the turnbacks, but I was kind of seeing the same things that you are, and I was doing a dive into some of Brad Cox's stats in Formulator, and I was just kind of really surprised at how bad the stats were with his turnbacks. Over the past 5 years, going route to sprint in dirt stakes races, he's 1 for 22, 5% with a 45-cent ROI. It's really hard to find a Brad Cox stat that's quite that negative because he's just a trainer that has really positive stats basically across the board. And it's not like I've ever thought Verifying was that talented. I mean, he's a horse that generally runs well when he gets good trips, and he's probably gonna have to close from last in this race. I don't really know if he's that kind of horse. So it feels like he's the sort that's gonna take more money than I really would want to warm up to, especially if he's in the 4 or 5 to 1 range. So he's not for me. I agree about New York Thunder. I mean, there are a couple horses we're going to talk about in this sequence that are coming off these gigantic figs that are outliers in the rest of their past performances, and he's one of them. And I'm not a big believer in the bounce theory, but I do want to, give some credence to the idea that this horse has needed a lot of time between his prior starts, and now they're trying to come back in 4 weeks off the best effort of his career when they were very selective about where they were going to run him prior to that, kind of waiting for the perfect spot, perfect moment to run. Just feels like sometimes when these horses put forth these huge efforts, the next race, even when it's a grade one, it turns into a little bit of an afterthought as you just try to, get this horse to maintain his form. So I'm a little skeptical of him, especially on the stretch out to 7. And, it's kind of just deciding between the two Bob Baffert runners, the same place that you were at. Watching the workouts myself, I kind of prefer the way Fort Bragg is training a little bit to Arabian Lion. I'd watch out for Reincarnate wherever he runs next, because he actually outworked Arabian Lion in his big workout for this two-back. But Arabian Lion he's a better horse than I ever sort of gave him credit for, and clearly Bob Baffert has done a nice job turning him around from where he was early in the season, where it just looked like he was going to be this major disappointment. Turning back has helped him. I still kind of prefer Fort Bragg's races. I mean, that Pat Day Mile came up almost unbelievably fast, but aside from General Jim, the horses out of it have basically validated that speed figure, and Fort Bragg certainly did last time when he got back into the Bob Baffert stable. Like you said, that was a really powerful performance, beating a horse like Saudi Crown, who, if he was in here, would be very formidable. And I just think the slight turn back to 7 furlongs really suits this horse. I never kind of totally believed, even though he's a son of Tappet, that he wanted to go those 2-turn distances. He actually ran deceptively well in a few of those races, including the Florida Derby, where he made this crazy early move after missing the break. But just seems like he's really figured things out, especially turning back to these one-turn races. So I like Fort Bragg quite a bit in this race. I'd probably lean on him a little bit, using Arabian Lion and going somewhat against the two others that are likely to take money, Verifying in New York Thunder.
Yeah, I think one of the good points you made about New York Thunder is him coming back somewhat quickly off of that strong performance. The other thing, and I mean, this is the Time-Form-US Pacecast after all. The pace line in his Amsterdam is very average when you compare it to the types of speed figures that horses like Fort Bragg has earned in the early portion of his races. And what I mean by that is that, I mean, this horse is going to get forced along early a lot more than he did last time. He was scratched 4 times between March and July in races of different calibers. He was entered in a turf sprint stake at Keeneland and scratched. He ran at Woodbine. He was entered in the Woody Stevens and scratched. He was entered in the Maxfield at Ellis and scratched. So Jorge Delgado has been extremely selective about where he wanted to run him. And it just feels like he's getting called up to the big leagues, to make a cringy sports analogy. And he's going to meet horses, I think, that are just a little bit better. So I agree with you. And I did actually watch that Arabian Lion and Reincarnate workout. And I was actually dying for Reincarnate to come for the Travers at that point. Was a little surprised to see him not come in National Treasure instead. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah, I think it's going to be Bob's world in the Alan Jerkins.
Yeah, I really like that point you made about the Time-Form-US pace figures. I think sometimes people get a little bit dazzled by those early fractions you see in the 6.5 furlong races at Saratoga. There's a long run-up for those, and you often get artificially quicker fractions than you would typically see in other sprint distances like the 6 and 7 furlong races at Saratoga. So obviously, Craig's Time-Form-US pace figures account for that run-up and the unusually, typically faster times.
No doubt about it. And so, it makes for an interesting question from a handicapping perspective, because, you hear about, and I really thought about this a lot more when I started making buyer speed figures, was, races are situational, obviously. Some races exist in isolation. Some are never duplicated. Some are duplicated. If New York Thunder runs poorly tomorrow, it's really not going to have anything to do with him bouncing. It's going to have to do with the fact that he had the most ideal set of circumstances last time out, having the lead, setting moderate fractions, being inside against inferior horses. Tomorrow he's running against better horses where he's unlikely to have an unencumbered trip on the front end. And if he runs 10 to 15 points slower, it's not because he bounced, it's because he went from having everything his way to having virtually nothing his way. So to me, those are the kind of horses you're supposed to bet against. You're supposed to almost predict the regression.
Let's move on to another Grade 1 event going that same 7 furlong distance on the main track. The Ballerina, race 10. And Nick, sometimes these Grade 1s in the middle of the year come up a little disappointing. You get the star power and then nobody else wants to show up, sort of like the case in the Forego earlier in this card, which we're not going to talk about. But not so in this Ballerina, because there are some horses in this race that are going to be big prices that are awfully good, but it's going to be hard to take down the two favorites, Echo Zulu and Goodnight Olive. The latter, the divisional leader from last year, the champion, and Echo Zulu, who, kind of like New York Thunder, is coming off this crazy performance when she won the Honorable Miss earlier in the meet. If she repeats that effort, she's going to be tough to beat.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it makes you wonder if maybe what we should have seen all along from Echo Zulu was just that, like, open the throttle, run fast, and bury everybody type of those slash and burn type tactics that they used last time out. Because, Frank's Rockette had been pretty solid this year. She's never really been a marquee horse. She's never been a Grade 1 horse. She's always been a very solid Grade 2.5 type horse. And Echo Zulu just buried her. And did it setting fractions, at least from a TimeformUS perspective, that we hadn't seen from her in a couple of years. And Echo Zulu had the benefit of being a tremendously fast 2-year-old who, when you dig through her form, you realize her worst race, and I'm making the quotation marks on my hands, was the Oaks, where she ran extremely well behind a razor-sharp informed Secret Oath and Nest, who ended up being the division winner, setting a hot pace and staying on for fourth. So Echo Zulu is really the model of consistency and a horse that I was really glad to see put forth that really strong performance. I also think that she had some races prior to last time where her Beyer speed figure actually could have been a little bit higher, including that win at Churchill in the winning colors. So I don't think it's as much of a one-off type performance as it might look on paper. And I'm expecting her to run well once again. She's loose on paper. There isn't even another horse in here that you could say, okay, well, if they really go bonkers and want to put this horse on the lead, she could force Echo Zulu into a tougher spot. Anybody who wants to get close to Echo Zulu early in here is basically just writing their own ticket out. So I think she's going to be almost impossible to beat. I think my bet in the race, from a Pick-5 perspective, I'm just going to use her. I'm not going to monkey around with much elsewhere. I'm going to try and bet one exacta of her over Caramel Swirl, who I think maybe ran a little bit better at the Better Roses than I originally thought. And that's because I'm concerned about Goodnight Olive in the sense that I think we saw Goodnight Olive at her best in the Ballerina and the Filly and Mare Sprint last year. I don't like that they've become so committed from a tactical perspective to dragging her out of races. I just think she could get lost in here if she ends up too far back, because Echo Zulu will have such an enormous advantage.
Yeah, I'm sort of two minds about Echo Zulu. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, that she's a horse that maybe was slightly underrated coming into her 4-year-old season because she had run so well in some races last year when they were trying a variety of distances with her. And I agree. The 112 Beyer, the 133 TimeformUS speed figure, it didn't totally come out of nowhere, but it's still a big jump from where she had ever been in the past, even if you're going to project some of her prior speed figures up a couple points. It's a new top for her by at least 10 points. And, she's going to take a lot of money based on that speed figure. And we're kind of hearkening back to the discussion we were having about New York Thunder is, how much faith do you want to put in one number on a horse? Because if you sort of draw a line through that honorable miss, and I'm not saying that you should, but just, the thought exercise, if it's not there, does she really deserve to be favored over Goodnight Olive and kind of everyone conceding the race to her? I don't know. Yes, she's got a lot going for her. Probably the lone speed in this race. The only horse that you could possibly project to press her is the number 5, Wicked Halo, and I would say she's unlikely to even run here. She's cross-entered to Charlestown tonight. I haven't seen reporting about where she's running yet, but even if she goes in this spot, she's the same connection, so I doubt she's going to go after Echo Zulu, and she's just supposed to have a lot working in her favor, but I feel like all of that is so obvious, and she's going to really get bet down off the huge speed figure, off the projected perfect trip, and, Goodnight Olive, I've never been her biggest fan, personally. I thought she got a little bit overrated coming into this season. I wasn't so convinced that she was as massively unlucky as some people thought in that Derby City Distaff when she lost earlier in the year. But what I will say is, that conversation that you started about the tactics they used with her, which I agree with, they've really been intent on taking her off the pace. I think a lot of that had to do with her drawing inside post positions in 3 consecutive starts, with the Madison, the Derby City, and then drawing the rail last time, the Better Roses. And riding a heavy favorite, I think Irad sort of didn't want to take the chance of getting caught in a potential pace situation by going forward, so he just sort of relied on her late kick in those spots. Now she's drawn outside, and I remember last year going through her campaign, Chad Brown was always saying, I prefer outside draws for a horse like this because she can get into that rhythm in a stalking position, and I feel like they're going to be able to change the tactics now that she's drawn outside, and she'll be the one that's just tracking right outside Echo Zulu. And, Goodnight Olive, I mean, she's got a big turn of foot, a nice kick on her. She loves 7 furlongs. If she's a bigger price than Goodnight Olive, I kind of have to go in that direction. I mean, I'm sorry, if she's a bigger price than Echo Zulu, I kind of have to go in that direction, even though I've never been the biggest believer in her, because I just feel like the value is going to be more with Goodnight Olive this time as opposed to Echo Zulu. But regardless, in a Pick-5 sequence, I'll probably use them both in equal strength, or use them both to some extent. Maybe I'll make Goodnight Olive the A and Echo Zulu the B or something like that. But I'm not against these two. I just don't want to sort of heap too much praise on Echo Zulu off one race.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think if she didn't have the tactical edge that she does, it would be a little bit easier to be critical of her. For what it's worth, Wicked Halo did not ship to Charlestown. I don't know if that necessarily means she's running here, but Steve Asmussen sent Society to Charlestown. Oh, just another filly and mare sprinter coming off a gigantic buyer speed figure. And Wicked Halo, of course, is a horse who probably would be a major contender in this race if it was a weaker running of it. But yeah, I think that's what it boils down to. Is the other thing about Echo Zulu that you can also say about Goodnight Olive is that they've both been at their absolute best at Saratoga. And I mean, Echo Zulu is a horse who earned 2 90+ buyer speed figures as a 2-year-old, which, you very rarely see one of those. You almost never see them duplicated to the point where it happens twice. And, Echo Zulu beat legitimate competition in that spin away back a couple of years ago. It's irrelevant now, but she's a horse who I think has been better than she's gotten a lot of credit for throughout her career. And I'm hoping that this is just not as many people were watching the 4th race on a Wednesday, even at a place like Saratoga. I'm hoping this is kind of her coming out party because I do think she deserves a little bit of grade 1 glory as a 4-year-old now in front of everybody.
Yeah, and I think where we're kind of in agreement is that it's going to be really hard to beat both of these horses. I mean, you could maybe make a case against one of them, but as good as Caramel Swirl is, as good as Monterey is, who we haven't even talked about in Wicked Halo, beating both favorites in this spot is going to be a pretty Herculean task.
Yeah, I think you're either using one and you're getting ambitious with just preferring one to the other, or you're using both. I can't make a case for really anyone else. Matarea did beat Goodnight Olive 2 starts back. I mean, that race gets about as big an asterisk as you can find given the trip that Goodnight Olive had on the rail. And don't get me wrong, Matarea ran excellent that day, but she's probably a filly who's a little bit better in Kentucky than she's been anywhere else, and I don't really see her duplicating that type of effort here.
Let's move on to the last couple legs of this sequence. The Grade 1 Sword Dancer is race 11, 1.5 miles on the inner turf course, a field of 7 signed on, and I had a real tough time with this race, Nick. I mean, because you've got a horse drawn on the outside in Stone Age that is sort of the key to this race, and in some ways the key to this sequence, because if you're with this horse, it's really going to slim down your ticket a lot. If you're against this horse, it sort of opens up the sequence to paying a lot more, and also a lot of horses in this race, because if you're kind of against Stone Age, you can really sort of start to get a little creative in this Sword Dancer, because it did not come up the strongest edition of this race that we've ever seen. I'll just kind of say where I'm at on Stone Age to start. I mean, obviously, if this horse runs back to his Breeders' Cup turf, he's probably going to be too tough for this field to beat. But I'm a little skeptical of this runner. I mean, he ran well last year in his other starts in the U.S. He had some trips in the Belmont Derby and the Saratoga Derby. I wouldn't say that I was blown away by those performances or how he ran relative to some competition in there. And I know he put forth some good efforts going into the Breeders' Cup last year and the Irish Champion and the Champion, but he really went off form at the end of the season. I mean, he was heavily favored in that Hong Kong Vase, didn't show up, then was just a total no-show, basically getting eased in that race in Doha after that. And now he's been off for so long. switching from Aidan O'Brien to Chad Brown. For what it's worth, I looked up some stats for Chad Brown with horses like this in Grade 1 races, foreign shippers in Grade 1s. He's 0 for 7 over the past 5 years. And I think the 7-horse sample is really the thing that jumps out at you, because Chad Brown doesn't do this. I mean, he doesn't run these horses that he gets first time in his barn in the top level races right away. He likes to have a prep. He's kind of said this horse has not been trained to be at his best for this spot. They're kind of looking down the road with him. So I feel like he's going to take a lot of money off that Breeders' Cup Turf performance, and I don't totally trust him.
I totally agree with you. I don't, I think and you made him 6 to 5, and I think you're 100% right. Um, but I think he's going to be 6 to 5 by default, and I don't want 6 to 5 default shots. I don't want horses that are going to be particularly short prices because the public can't warm up to anybody else. I'd rather try and find a way to warm up to some of them myself, if that makes sense. And so he's a horse that just, to me, has never really, other than the Breeders' Cup Turf, which, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, Aidan O'Brien's horses ran a hole in the wind that weekend. He had a number of tremendous performances from Tuesday, and the horse that won the juvenile turf, the juvenile fillies turf. He had horses run well all weekend. We had seen it had been kind of a lull for Aidan O'Brien in this country in big races for a while, but he definitely reversed that in a hurry. And, when I saw that he was 6 to 5 in the Hong Kong Box, I really wish I hadn't stayed up late to watch those races, because, I mean, could you imagine this horse being 6 to 5? I don't know what the rest of the field looked like, but they definitely put a lot of faith in that Breeders' Cup Turf performance, where, that was a fast-paced race where he did, and he ran well. I don't want to make it seem like I don't think he ran a good race that day, because he did, but he kind of ran second because there were a bunch of no-shows that had been worn out by a hot pace. I'm gonna do something maybe slightly off the wall and try and work the other Euro angle and take Bolshoi Ballet. I've never been a big fan of this horse, but I think he needs fast ground, and I think that the more I went back and watched his Breeders' Cup Turf from 2021 and then some of the races that he's run this year, the better I could just conclude that he wants to be forward, he wants to be in a decent stalking spot, and he wants firmer turf. I can make a better case for him at 5 or 6 to 1 than I can for Stone Age at even money or less. And so I'd just rather take the bigger price. I'm perfectly prepared to be wrong, but I'd rather lose my money on him than on Stone Age. I think in a multi-race play, you have to use Stone Age because you don't want to be beaten by him. But boy, he's tough to take at a short number. And the American contingent to me is very average. Channelmaker was in the right place at the right time, as he's been able to on a number of occasions. But we don't know what was going to happen in the final quarter mile of that race if Rebels Romance stayed upright, and maybe Channelmaker ends up running second, and then this race looks entirely different. So that was kind of my thought on it. I thought there were a number of horses that were pretty easy tosses, even in a small field.
Yeah, we were kind of thinking along the same lines, and maybe I'm going to take it a little further in a crazy direction than you did. But I mean, as far as Bolshoi Ballet goes, I agree. When you compare his U.S. races and his European form to Stone Age, kind of leading up to their Breeders' Cup Turf, I mean, it's not that different. And I agree. I mean, I thought that the Breeders' Cup Turf that Bolshoi Ballet ran in was a tougher Breeders' Cup Turf than the one that Stone Age did. And since then, Bolshoi Ballet has not run badly this year. I mean, that performance at Newbury in May was actually really good. He finished ahead of Breeders' Cup Turf winner Yabir in that spot, who was fourth in that race, and he was really game to just barely lose. He ran fine at Royal Ascot. I mean, and then they just took a shot last time in that Group 1 against the best horses in Europe. He had no chance that day. My one concern with Bolshoi Ballet is when you watch his races, if you give up on him, he's going to give up. He's the kind of horse that you have to start riding like a half mile from home and keep pushing on him the entire way, or else he's not going to put in that full effort. He's just one of those, as you say, bicycle horses that you have to keep pedaling on, as Richard Migliore likes to say on the Fox show. But I mean, I'm a little worried that John Velasquez has never ridden him, because he's the kind of horse that you have to know you need to ride that way, or else you're not going to get the full effort out of him. I think in a weird way, Bolshoi Ballet is the horse to beat in this race, or at least the one I think is the most dangerous from a price standpoint of the two that look like they have the best form. But I mean, let's just say we're right about Stone Age, and he's not all he's cracked up to be. And let's say Bolshoi Ballet just decides not to show up like he sometimes does. Well, then this race is basically just a rerun of the Bowling Green. I mean, I'm personally not a big believer in Pioneering Spirit, who I get why they're taking a shot here, but I think his form is, just kind of ridiculous against weaker horses. The other four are all coming out of the Bowling Green, so I don't think we can just say, let's dismiss the Bowling Green horses, because it's not like the two alternatives that we have to choose from are standing on the most solid ground. So with them looking at the Bowling Green, I agree with what you're saying. Channel Maker, kind of a last time, was the time horse. He got everything his own way that day on the front end, was a big price, and obviously, Rebels Romance probably would have won that race. I agree with all of that. But, Channel Maker, he's a horse that when he doesn't get that perfect trip, setting his own pace, he's not nearly as dangerous. And we'll see if a horse like Bolshoi Ballet is aggressively ridden, or perhaps even Stone Age, who has shown some speed at different points in his career. So, I'm not sure that I trust Channel Maker to do it again twice in a row, but also he's going to be a much shorter price this time, so I don't want to try to talk myself into him again. Soldier Rising did have a valid excuse in that Bowling Green. If you can find a replay of the race, he took a really hard bump from Rebels Romance when that horse lost the rider coming around the far turn and basically lost all his momentum and had no chance after that. The problem with Soldier Rising is he's still Soldier Rising, and he almost never wins, and I think a mile and a half is a little tough for him. He's very pace compromised. When I was going back to watch that Bowling Green, I sort of didn't initially realize how well Daunt ran, because this horse was 3 wide around all 3 turns, was put in a position where he had no cover for most of the race, chasing outside. I know the pace kind of held together, but he lost significant ground compared to Channel Maker and was still in the mix in mid-stretch before fading a little bit. I mean, didn't get that dissimilar a trip to Tawny Port, who we just saw come back and win the Johns Call pretty impressively early this week, and Daunt was even wider than that one around the turn. So, I know that when you're sort of thinking about a horse like Daunt for these connections winning a race like the Sword Dancer, you probably sound a little crazy, but, if you have the opinions that we have, where you're a little against Stone Age, you think Channel Maker was last time was the time, suddenly Daunt doesn't start to look that crazy in this race, just considering it's not the strongest edition of the Sword Dancer. I know he's going to be a gigantic price at here, so he's the kind of horse that I just have to take a shot with, given my opinions about the others.
Yeah, the 2 horses that have come out of the Bowling Green so far, you mentioned Tawny Port, who won the Johns Call, Never Explained came back and ran in the Arlington Million and at least equaled his speed figure. What you're saying, of course, is that you believe Daunt can move forward. And, obviously if he runs a 92 again, he's not going to win. But if he's able to get a little bit of cover, get a little bit more pace in front of him, probably be a little bit farther back, I think he does have the opportunity to get a piece of it. And I think I've definitely heard worse ideas for horses that could fill out the trifecta potentially, and even a little bit more if things break their way.
Let's move on to the last leg of this sequence, the Grade 1 Travers, that Midsummer Derby. And Nick, I mean, it's only 7 horses, but all the right players are in this race, or almost all of the right players. Obviously, we already mentioned Reincarnate not coming for this race, but I mean, as far as the horses that won the major races in this division, you've got last year's 2-year-old champion, the Derby, the Preakness, the Belmont winner. I mean, this is the way that you want to see a Travers come up. And beyond all of that, I thought this was a really interesting race to handicap.
It really is. It's a fun race. We've seen all these horses on numerous occasions, and Forte, with all that went on in the first half of the year, became the horse that was the single most interesting 3-year-old in terms of what he was going to have to offer once he was able to get back into a regular training pattern and being able to run and so on and so forth. So it's just fascinating to see how this is going to shake out at a mile and a quarter, with all of them coming in, hopefully able to fire their best shot. I picked Arcangelo. I kind of became an Arcangelo fan prior to the Peter Pan, and I know it's always dangerous when you're betting to become too married to horses that you like just in general. But I think that he's a horse with a tremendous amount of ability. I loved his Belmont. I thought he was able to overcome a much more strenuous early pace than he had ever seen before. And I know in a way he kind of bottomed that field out in terms of being able to race forwardly, getting the lead the way he did so decisively off the turn, and then holding sway to the finish. And so it makes me feel better about the scenario he could get into if he's a little bit farther off the pace here, if they really sprint early, but also if they don't. And I think that's what kind of leads me in his direction. I think you can come up with legitimate knocks on everybody. You can also come up with positives on everybody. It's just that kind of race, and that includes horses that are going to be as short as potentially 6-5 like Forte, and then as big as a horse like Captain Trice at 15-1, who I know you've had some affinity for in the past, and I have as well. who I think a case can be made for. It's a relatively weak one in comparison to his competition, but I wanted Arcangelo. I'm going to be excited to see how he performs in here, but I will admit I'm very intrigued by this race in general.
Yeah, I really don't disagree with anything you're saying about Arcangelo. For me, the problem is I wasn't quite a believer going into the Belmont Stakes, and in retrospect, I probably downgraded him a little bit too much going into there. And I wasn't on him at nearly 8-1. Do I want to take him now at 5-2 or the second choice in this race? It just feels like I'm jumping on the bandwagon too late if I go with Arcangelo. So for me, I've got him in the mix somewhere. I picked him third in this race, but he's not the kind of horse that I'm going to pick on top here. And I kind of view Forte in a similar fashion. I mean, Forte has proven to be a little better than maybe I expected he would be early in the season when I was, growing more and more skeptical of him as he didn't get faster. And he ran a valiant race in the Belmont Stakes to ultimately get up for second. I didn't necessarily agree with the narrative that he had a bad trip in that Belmont, because I thought he sort of, took back and allowed others to make premature moves in that race and then made the last move to sort of pick up pieces to get second at the end. But still, I mean, he was running 12 furlongs off a 10-week layoff. You've got to give him some credit. And then he came back in the Jim Dandy, and I thought the blinkers did what they were supposed to do. He did not disengage around the far turn like he had in his two prior starts and was in the bridle the entire way. Say what you will about the bumping in the stretch and whether there should have been a DQ. It doesn't really matter as far as handicapping this Travers Stakes. He got there in the end, and he's just really gritty. He fights for it. I expect Forte to run well. I just don't necessarily want to bet him at 6-5 or 7-5 in this race. I just think it's a way more competitive Travers than that. So I'm sort of looking in different directions. And I think Mage he's a hard horse to assess because he's got this Kentucky Derby performance where he obviously got a great trip. I mean, broke a little slowly, but it all worked out after that with regard to the pace and, the journey that Javier Castellano was able to orchestrate for him. So you want to downgrade him a little bit, maybe, due to the fact that he got the trip that day, but he still won the Derby, and I think you have to give him credit for that. And it's easy to make an excuse for his Preakness given the race flow of that race, and the connections were pretty explicit that they just did not have him fully cranked for the Haskell last time, and I actually think the Haskell was a really strong race. I mean, I know there aren't that many horses coming out of the Haskell into this Travers, but Mage ran well. I mean, he got there in mid-stretch and got a little tired at the end. If you think Mage is going to improve off that performance, he can obviously win this race, and I think he's going to be the best price of the big three.
I don't disagree. I don't know what to do with Mage, and I agree with you that he's a hard horse to assess. I'm beginning to think that his Kentucky Derby performance is sort of an outlier in terms of who he is overall. I thought the connections were, and I'm friendly with Ramiro, one of the part owners. I thought the whole, he's not fully cranked, he's 80% was sort of a brilliant pre-race tactic, because if he ran poorly, you could say, well, hell, he was only 80%. And if he ran great, you would say, well, I mean, look at what he did at 80%, right? So I'm on the fence in terms of the Haskell. I don't know how good a race it was. I know it got a respectable speed figure as far as this crop goes. Obviously, we'll see Go Rocket Ride and Arabian Night in next week's Pacific Classic, which is shaping up as just a really tremendously interesting race. And I thought Mage ran well, all things considered. I wonder if maybe what my problem with him is that now two races in a row in the final furlong of a 9 furlong plus race, he was clearly giving way. And I wonder if maybe that ability to finish in the Derby was so circumstantial because of the pace scenario that he'll really never be able to do that unless he somehow got in a race run at that kind of clip early, and he's not going to get that again. It's probably never going to happen for him again in the entirety of his career at 10 furlongs. And so that's my sort of critical approach to him. I will not deny, though, that of the major players, he definitely figures to offer the most value at 4-1 or, that kind of range. I mean, this is a horse that I was shocked to see him go off over 4-1 in the Haskell. Usually the Derby winner gets a tremendous amount of support at the windows pretty much for the rest of their career, but it's almost as if the public has always treated him as a bit of a fluky Derby winner. They don't print fluky on any of the stuff afterwards in terms of honoring him as the Derby winner. So I think his connections would be fine with taking that moniker. But the other horse that won a Triple Crown race that we've not mentioned yet that I think is worthy of at least some discussion is National Treasure. And I've never been a huge National Treasure fan. I thought that the Preakness was a particularly weak race where he was able to best Blazing Sevens, who's not a horse who I think excels at longer distances, and he was able to do so by setting a very moderate pace. But I do have to ask you, David, we talked about Reincarnate. We talked about how strongly he was training and the likelihood that Baffert was going to send both of him. And then all of a sudden, Bob's only sending National Treasure. And it at least makes me a little concerned in terms of how much Baffert might have confidence in this horse, that he might run better than I expect. And I don't want to find myself being beaten by him, because I think this is going to be a very simple proposition. The gate's going to open and he's going to go. And how much pressure Scotland wants to apply to him might have some impact on how he ends up finishing. But putting Bob Baffert horses in these kind of scenarios over the years, they've held up very well.
Yeah, it's dangerous to be too negative on some of these Bob Baffert horses, especially in these major races, because he's not sending them if they're not ready to put forth the top effort. I guess we'll see if National Treasure's best really stacks up against some of the other horses in here, because I didn't think he even ran that well in the Preakness. I mean, given the pace advantage he had and the trip, I mean, he was supposed to beat Blazing Sevens by more than a head. So I think National Treasure would really need to step up and put forth a career best performance to win a race like the Travers. But as you say, he's running him. He's not running anybody else in this race. And the fact that they're taking the blinkers off, I know some people are reading that as maybe an intention to take back off the pace. I would not say that. I think the fact that Bob is taking the blinkers off is rather a vote of confidence in this horse, because he tinkers around with blinker changes on his horses quite a bit, and the less equipment they wear, I mean, it's often the better. I mean, he's training well enough to not need the blinkers, let's put it that way. He's a horse that's always trained like a beast in the morning, so I don't want to say that he's training better than he ever has before. It's sort of hard to read into that. He's a horse that Bob always works solo. He doesn't really work him with other horses, or he hasn't been lately, so tough to say that he's doing better than he ever has before, but maybe just the fact that he's running here, is a hint at that. So, I'm somewhat against him here, but I agree. I have trepidations about being too against a horse like this. Personally, I have trouble making cases for Disarm, who I don't think he's had big excuse in his races recently, and Scotland is just not for me. I mean, the Curlin winner, he beat a much weaker field than this, so I'm going to circle back to a horse that you mentioned towards the top as maybe the biggest price in this race, in Tapit Trice. And, I was a fan of this horse early on. I sort of went off him after the Bluegrass because I didn't think that was a strong race, and sort of was against him through the Triple Crown season. But his Belmont, I want to revisit, because he ran really, really well in that race, and he sort of got a crazy ride. I mean, the thing that you don't want to do in the Belmont Stakes is move at the start of the far turn with 5 furlongs to go. And I guess Luis Saez just thought he has to ride this horse this way, but that's exactly what he did. I mean, he made a 5 furlong move in that race, and you almost can't see it in the running line, because, when the points of calls are picked up, or when they're picked up. And I mean, he actually got within maybe a length and a half of the lead at one point on the far turn before, the leaders kicked on a little bit. And, he lost some focus at the top of the stretch, but then when he felt Forte to his outside, he re-engaged at the end. I mean, and he just lost so much ground in that race, made multiple moves. There's an argument that he perhaps ran the best race in the Belmont. The Arcangelo lovers might disagree with that, because he did win decisively, but Arcangelo, I don't think you can disagree, got a great ride from Javier Castellano in the Belmont, sort of taking back when the pace really heated up on the backstretch, and then making the move at the right time. Tapit Trice ran well, and then last time in the Haskell, he just got the wrong ride for the kind of horse that he is. He's always going to break slowly. You just sort of have to accept that. But after that, Saez kind of rode him forward and put him down on the rail, tracking 2 long shots that were inevitably going to back up in his face, and that's exactly what happened. And he got steadied, lost his momentum at a critical point in the race, and just couldn't recover from it. They're making changes now. They're putting the blinkers on. Arguably, he's a horse that they should have put blinkers on a long time ago, just based on the way that he runs. And they're switching to Jose Ortiz. And Jose Ortiz, I'm not saying he's a better rider than Luis Saez, but he's a completely different kind of rider than Saez. And he's going to let this horse settle a bit more where he's comfortable, and probably be a little more patient with the move. Maybe he's just a horse that's never going to figure it out, but I feel like the evidence of the Belmont Stakes is there to say he's as good as these horses, and he's finally going to be a big price.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I feel the same way. And for as talented a rider, and Luis Saez is a world-class rider, he's a bad fit for this horse, because Luis Saez is a guy who wants to Well, he's a horse who he's a horse who generally seems to run in spots. And Luis Saez is a guy who, you can visibly take in that he's pumping away on horses when he needs to get them to move. And so it felt like he was just constantly riding this horse. And it's a little bit like Julia Shining in that respect. And I know part of it is Saez, part of it is that these horses are running in spots. I'm not as concerned about blinkers going on this horse and Todd having average numbers in that category because I believe this is a horse who should have been wearing blinkers his whole career. He's just always kind of run erratically, inconsistently in terms of how he distributes his energy, and he would have been better off having blinkers from the start and being able to let himself settle. The hope, I think, is that when he does settle into a spot after a half mile or so, it's significantly closer than it would normally be. And I think the nightmare scenario is that he falls far back, like he did in a race like the Kentucky Derby, when he really doesn't have that ability. Mage has a very quick step, and Mage handles turns extremely well. He's a little bit lighter, smaller horse, whereas Tapit Trice is just a lumbering ox. Right. I mean, he's a horse that's always he's gonna need to be able to produce that big long stride. And this is the time to bet him if you have any inclination to do so, because he's going to be the biggest price in the field. And he's a horse that has legitimately run as fast as anybody in here. He ran extremely well in the Belmont, as you said, and you're going to get the value that you've been seeking his entire career. So, yeah, to me, this is the time where you're supposed to try it. And he'll be on my tickets very much as I actually picked him second as a horse that I want to give an opportunity to try and win.
Yeah, I picked him on top. I put him over Mage. I mean, it might be a bad pick. I'm not going to be surprised when Tapit Trice runs fifth in this race. It just, you say, oh, he's Tapit Trice. But, I mean, just applying my typical trip handicapping and value philosophies, he's the kind of horse I'm supposed to land on in this race. So, giving him a shot. Well, Nick, we went through the handicapping. Let's just briefly sort of recap. And if you're going to play this Pick-5 sequence, how would you attack it and where would you lean?
Yeah, I think that, the first leg, as we said, depending on what happens, of course, with the AE Super Quest, I could find myself being 3 to 4 deep there in terms of main horses. I know I'll use Extendo and Harry Time. I'll use Super Quest if he gets in. It's a vastly different race at that point. That's where I'd warm up more to Monet Never and get him into the mix. I'll probably use Highly Flammable at that point as well, the other Mark Casse trainee. And then in the Jerkins, I'm going to use the 2 Bob Baffert horses as mains. I'll back up very, very slightly with Verifying and New York Thunder. They would be more like C's for me. Basically, if they win, I would need to have A horses in every other leg in order to win. I'll lean more on Echo Zulu than anybody else and try and get a little bit more bullish there, because then I'll use Bolshoi Ballet and Stone Age to ideally get alive to Archangelo for, 2 to 3 times the number of units that I was alive to Tapit Trice for. And if I get alive to both of them, that's fine. I'm perfectly fine being alive only to Archangelo if there's a situation where, one of my backup horses wins along the way.
Yeah, we have some similar ideas here, maybe just diverging in a few races. I mean, in that opener, it's really tough, the 8th race. I mean, you have to narrow it down to some extent. I'm, probably going to use Monet Never as an A with some backups that would include Southern Horse, Super Quest if he gets in, Detroit City. I like the case that you were making for Extendo. I think you have some good points about him and Harry Time, so I could throw them on my tickets as C's. In the 9th race, I think that I'm going to use Fort Bragg as the only A and Arabian Lion as a B and sort of just try to beat Verifying in New York Thunder in that spot. And I didn't mention him, but I'd even throw Drew's Golden as a C. He's a horse that I think is going to get ignored on the board, and he's got races that put him in the mix and might get the right kind of pace setup. So he's a horse that I would use a C in that race. In the Ballerina, like I said, I'm not going to try to split hairs too much between Echo Zulu and Goodnight Olive. I think you can make cases for both of them. I expect Goodnight Olive to be the slightly better value, so maybe I'll make her the A and Echo Zulu the B, but I basically want those two. In the Sword Dancer, I'm going to just go against Stone Age. I'm going to use Daunt, my top pick. I think he's going to inject a lot of value into the sequence if he does. If I am right about him, I'll use Bolshoi Ballet, and I'll use a little bit of Soldier Rising because, you can make excuses for his last race, but he's not the horse that I can have too much confidence in. And then in the Travers, I'm going to primarily lean on Tapit Trice and Mage just from a value standpoint. I think that they're the two that, really, fit my opinion about the race. And then as backups, forte in Arcangelo. I'm probably going to leave National Treasure off my ticket, and based on the discussion we're having, I might end up regretting that, but I just kind of have never really been a believer in that horse, so I kind of have to let him beat me in this spot. But, it's the kind of Travers where you could talk yourself into a lot of horses.
No doubt about it. It's a race where I've heard cases from a variety of people that I speak to on almost all 7 of them. So it's a fun race when you're going to deal with that kind of scenario, no doubt.
Well, Nick, I really appreciate you making time to come on the podcast. And for people that were fans of listening to the two of us, I think we'll have something else out this week.
We will. We're going to have a New York bred Showcase Day podcast for Sunday that'll be available on the In the Money Media Network, brought to you by the New York Thoroughbred Breeders. So very excited about that. Yeah, we'll be taping that tomorrow. You're getting plenty of me this week.
Yeah, looking forward to discussing that interesting Sunday card of New York Breds tomorrow. Well, Nick, thanks for coming on. Everybody, thanks for listening to this TimeformUS forecast. You can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, everybody, thanks for listening, and good luck on Travers Weekend.